I have just the ticket if you want a great personalized gift for a child. This set makes a great baby shower gift that can be displayed in the child's room while they're a baby, and when they get older, the train will become a toy they can play with for hours at a time. The train includes an engine, freight cars to carry the letters, and a caboose. I'll give you the plan source and the wheels, magnets, and roundhead nails you'll need to build the train. The engine, cars, letters, and caboose are all easy enough to build that even a beginning woodworker can make them. I built and sold hundreds of these, and I'll take you through the project step by step. Let's get rolling. The engine, cars, and caboose are all 2 1/4 wide, so I'll start by ripping some poplar to that width. I use poplar for these so the components can all be painted later, but you could use any wood you choose. I do, however, recommend using a hardwood. This board is slightly over 6 inches wide and about 48 inches long. I started by setting the rip fence slightly less than the stock's width to trim a bit off one side because the board has rough edges. I don't have a joiner, but by running the board through the table saw, I can create a 90-degree smooth edge and work from there. The first setup was complete, so I ran the board through to create that clean edge. You'll notice that I use the blade guard because I can and because I should. I see many videos of woodworkers not using the blade guard when they can. I used a push stick for the last few inches, and when the cut was complete, I shut off the saw and let the blade come to a full stop before I removed the board. This process takes a few seconds longer, but working as safely as possible is always worth the time and effort. I flipped the board around so the finished edge was now closest to the fence and oriented correctly for the next cut. I moved the fence to 2 1/4 inches from the blade, locked down the rip fence, and set the feather board up for the new width of the board. The feather board holds the board tightly against the rip fence until it reaches the blade. When I made the first cut, I noticed the outfeed roller needed to be further from the saw, so I moved it. Then I flipped the blade guard back down into place, put my hearing protection back on, and turned the saw back on for the second cut. When I got to the point where the board was entirely on the table, I used the push stick to finish the cut and again turned off the saw when the cut was complete. I took the 2 1/4 strip I just created and set it aside on the right hand of the saw's extension table. Then I took the remaining piece, moved it against the fence, and adjusted the feather board for the new width. Make sure the feather board stops pushing inward before the board reaches the saw blade, or you could create a dangerous kickback situation. I started the saw again and made the second cut in the same manner as the previous one. Once again, I set the 2 1/4 strip aside and I took the long scrap piece out of the way. I can't think of any use for a 1x48 piece of poplar, so I'll likely cut it into several shorter pieces and toss them. I needed more 2 1/4 strips than this, so I ran the whole procedure again 2 or 3 times until I felt I had enough material for the next step. The plans are relatively large and they're printed on blueprint-size pages. I purchased the plans from Cherry Tree Toys years ago. They recently downsized and are no longer selling wooden parts, but when I checked their website, the name train plans were still listed. I'll leave a link to their site in the description. The base for the engine requires a 60-degree bevel on the front, so I set my miter degree for 30 degrees. Huh? Why 30? Because 30 plus 60 equals 90. You'll see in a few seconds. I took one of the 2 1/4 strips, held it on edge against the miter saw fence, and down to my hearing protection. Then I cut across the board, flipped the board around, and made the same cut at the other end. Of course, you won't need to flip the board if you're only making one train, but I thought I'd show how I make these in batches in case someone out there wants to make several of these. Next, I need to cut these pieces to length, and I have several choices. One would be to reset the miter saw to 0 and make the 90-degree cuts on it. But that would become time-consuming since I plan on making a dozen or so of these engines. I could make the cuts with my table saw or even on the scroll saw, but since I have a radial arm saw, I chose to use that. These bases need to be 4.5 inches long, so I used my steel ruler to measure that distance from each end, and I used a square to draw a line across the board. I made the cross cut, flipped the board around, and made the same cut at the other end. I did the same thing with the second board. Now I have 2 boards with 2 straight ends, so I take them back to the miter saw to make beveled ends. This is why I like to leave the miter saw set at 30 degrees. I make the 4 cuts, return to the radial arm saw for the cross cuts, and repeat the process until these 2 boards have been converted into engine bases. I was able to cut 14 engine bases from those 2 48-inch long pieces. The plans show the caboose base at 3 15/16 inches. Really? 3 15/16? That makes no sense to me, so I'll make them an even 4 inches long. Because these don't have bevel cuts, I can make all the cuts with a radial arm saw. I marked 4 inches on the board and moved it over to the saw's fence. Then I remembered I had a mark on the fence at 4 inches because I put it there when cutting a previous batch of cabooses. This means I won't have to do any more measuring. I can line the board up with this mark, then move the board over to line up the end with the mark again. I'll perform the process a dozen times. I have 2 more cabooses than engines left in stock, and since I just cut 14 engines, if I got 12 cabooses, the number each on hand will be even again. The letter cars require a 3/4 inch wide groove up the middle where the letter will later be glued. For any of you new to woodworking, a groove is a cut that goes in the same direction as the grain of the wood. It does not go all the way through. That would make it a rip cut. A dado is a cut across the grain. Again, it only goes part way through. It can go all the way or part way across. One that goes part way across a board is called a stopped dado. The third type of cut is on the edge or end of a board, and it's called a rabbet. That's spelled R-A-B-B-E-T. The best way to make a groove, dado, or rabbet is usually with a dado blade. You can make any of these cuts with a standard blade, but a dado blade is more efficient for cuts wider than 1/8 of an inch because you can make the cut in one pass. The first step in the process is to unplug the table saw. You do not want the saw to be able to start while you're changing blades. I raise the blade to its maximum height and remove the table insert. It takes 2 wrenches to remove the old blade from the saw. One prevents the shaft from turning while the other loosens the nut holding the blade in place. I loosened and removed that nut, followed by the large washer next to the blade, and then the blade itself. The next step is to install the dado blade. Mine is what is called a stacked dado blade. There are 2 regular blades, one mounted on the inside of the stack and the other on the outside. You mount what are called chippers in between. The chippers only have 2 teeth, one at each end. The blades and chippers are all 1/8 wide, so you determine how many chippers to add by the width of the dado, groove, or rabbet you're cutting. I need a 3/4 inch groove, so that requires 2 outer blades plus 4 chippers. 6 times 1/8 equals 3/4. I made a 0 clearance insert for my dado blade and put that in place. You can't use the regular insert because the dado blade is wider than the opening. With that in place, I raised the blade just a bit. This groove only needs to be 1/8 inch deep or so. I moved the fence over and measured to the center of the groove on the 2¼ inch wide board. That means the blade's edge needs to be 3/4 from the fence. I used a steel ruler to set that up. Once satisfied with the fence setup, I plugged the saw back in. I grabbed a piece of scrap and my gripper push block to make a test cut. I ran the piece past the dado blade using the push block, turned off the saw when it was past the blade, and measured the placement of the groove. The edge was exactly 3/4 from the edge, meaning it would be perfectly centered on the 2¼ wide strip. With the setup complete, I'm ready to cut the grooves on all the 2¼ strips I have left. I set up a feather board to hold the strips tight against the fence and use the push block to hold the board down against the table. Both of these accessories are important to make these cuts safely. The feather board provides some protection against kickbacks. Make sure to keep good downward pressure on the push block to keep a consistent depth to the groove. I pushed the strip several inches past the blade and then moved it off to the side. I set that strip aside on the other side of the table saw and repeated the process until the grooves were cut on all the strips. With the groove in place, the next step will be to cut the cars to length. I unplugged the saw once again, removed the dado blade, replaced it with a standard blade, and reinstalled the 0 clearance table insert I made for this blade. The letter cars are 3 inches long. This is too short to comfortably and safely cut on the miter or radial arm saw. It would take forever on the scroll saw, and that tool is not the best for making long straight cuts anyway. There is an efficient way to make these repetitive cuts on the table saw, and I'll set up and use that. If you use the miter gauge to cut one car, measured 3 inches, made the next cut, and kept repeating that, the process would be painstakingly slow. There is a better way. I clamped the stop block onto the rip fence, placing it well before the blade. The width of the stop block doesn't matter. The distance between it and the blade must be the length of the blocks you want to cut, in this case 3 inches. For this operation I can use the blade guard again, so I installed it back in place after I put a plastic bin on the floor at the end of the table. This will catch the cars as they're pushed off the table. I plugged the saw back in and started cutting. I held the strip securely against the miter gauge, slid it until the end touched the stop block, and used the miter gauge to push the strip into the blade and make the cut. Then I slid the board away from the blade while holding it against the miter gauge, then pulled the miter gauge in the slot back toward me. I pulled the miter gauge back most of the way toward me, and then I slid the 2 1/4 strip to the right until it touched the stop block. I was now set for another 3-inch cut, so I completed it. Then I kept repeating that step until I came close to the end of the board. When you reach the end of a board, there's not enough wood left to grip it against the miter gauge safely. I set that short piece aside and will later make the last cut on my scroll saw. If you look at the blade guard after I've cut a few pieces, you'll see that they start falling off the end of the table after I've cut a few. I don't have to shut the saw off or reach dangerously to remove these pieces while the blade is spinning. Each new cut moves the previous pieces forward until they form a line and start falling off the table into the plastic bin I placed on the floor to catch them. I always do this with the blade guard in place because it helps prevent a piece from being kicked back if it touches the blade again after being cut. Because I build this project repeatedly, I made patterns for the engine cab and caboose structure. The plans call for 1.5-inch thick material, so I traced the patterns onto a large piece of 6/4 poplar. I already drilled the holes at the drill press. Now I'll cut this into several more manageable chunks before going to the scroll saw to cut the individual parts. I'll start with one of the engine cabs. Because this is 6/4 stock, I'm using a number 12 Pegasus modified geometry blade. If you're new to scroll sawing, the most challenging part of this cut will be making the 90-degree turns. The best way to make these is to cut to the point of the intersection, back off pressure slightly, just enough the blade is no longer cutting, and then slowly and carefully pivot the workpiece until the wood is facing the next direction you want to cut. Then you put pressure back on and start cutting again. While making that turn, you use the saw blade curve just created and the waist area to maneuver the blade. Here's a look at the first completed engine cab. The structure for the caboose is even easier to cut since it's a simple rectangle. I already explained how to make a 90-degree corner, and I had to use that technique again here. But since the rectangle was near the edge of the board, there were a couple of places where I just went past the corner to the edge. Then I was able to start the next cut at the edge and cut a long straight line. There's no shame in taking the easy way out when it's available. The next part that needs to be made is the boiler for the steam engine. A dowel rod forms the chamber, and I'll cut those to length on the scroll saw. You can do this on a table or miter saw, but I find either of those a little too nerve-wracking to cut pieces this short. I take a dowel, use a ruler to mark where I want the cuts, and then roll the dowel into the scroll saw blade. This keeps the dowel flat on the table and gives you a smooth cut. If careful, the cut will be at 90 degrees, but if you're slightly off, you can touch up the ends later at the disc sander. You need a flat surface on the bottom of the dowel rod to give it enough area to attach to the engine's base. The easiest way to create that is with the disc sander. The disc sander table is set at 90 degrees, so I rest one of the dowel on the table and then press the dowel up against the sanding disc. It only takes a couple of seconds, and then you have a flat surface on part of the dowel. This will later be glued to the train's platform. I need to make 14 of these, so I'll set each one aside as it's completed. Now I'll move back to the bases, where the next step is to mark the locations for the axle pegs. Because I make these frequently, I made masonite templates to speed up the process. I have templates for the engine and caboose, but I have another method for transferring the location to the letter cars because I usually make them 50 at a time. I take a base for the caboose, place the template against its side, and use a pencil to trace a circle where I want to drill the holes for the axle pegs. Then I flip the piece over and do the same thing on the other side. I have another template for the engines and follow the same marking procedure. I lined up 10 of the letter car bases, measured, and made a mark 5/8 in from each end on the first and last cars in line. I used a ruler to ensure the ends were aligned, and then I took the ruler and connected the marks along the line of parts. Then I flipped the bases over and marked the other side similarly. It didn't take long to mark the entire batch by using this method. I used my gauge to measure the diameter of the axle pegs. They're supposed to be 1/4 inch, but they're slightly smaller than that. I use a 15/64 drill bit to ensure a good fit. By the way, this illustrates why you need a large selection of drill bits in your shop. I purchased a set several years ago, and I can't tell you how many times the odd sizes, like 15/64, have been helpful. It took a couple of tries, but I was able to set the axle peg holes to the perfect depth. The 15/64 diameter hole ensures the pegs won't move around, and the properly set depth makes assembly easy. You'll see that shortly when I start putting the components together. At the drill press, I set up a fence to make it easy to keep all the car's bottoms aligned while drilling the holes. This fence ensures the holes for the axle pegs are all the same distance from the bottom of the engine, letter cars, and caboose. This is important. Otherwise, the wheels may not all touch the ground, or the car could sit at an angle rather than flat. The fence is simple. It's 2 pieces of plywood glued together at a 90-degree angle. I used 2 large spring clamps to hold it to the table. In addition to ensuring the holes are all drilled at the same distance from the bottom of the cars, I want all the holes drilled to the same depth. I want the holes drilled to a depth such that when I add the wheel and axle peg, the hole will only allow the peg to go deep enough that the wheel will turn freely. The drill press has a laser that shows the center of the drilling point, and I lined that up with the marks I made earlier. I have over 200 holes to drill, so it's nice to have a setup that ensures accuracy while still moving the process along. A good place to start assembly is with the train engine's boiler. I use a small glue bottle to place a couple of drops of glue in each orifice. I drilled a shallow 3/8 hole in the front, and I'll use a hammer to tap a mushroom plug into place there. This plug represents the locomotive's headlight. Then I added the smokestack and the small peg of the train whistle. I applied a small bead of glue to the bottom of this next part, spread the glue with my fingertip, and then added the engine cap to the back of the engine's base. The dowel with the flattened bottom that makes the steam engine's boiler goes in front of that. There's no easy way to clamp these parts, and I've found through experience that gravity alone works, so I slid this assembly aside on the workbench to allow the glue to dry. At this point, there was only one part to add to the caboose, and I added glue and spread it around with my fingertip. The caboose will get a railing at the back and a roof on top, which will be added right after the glue on this part is dry. I didn't show myself making the railing, so I'll describe the process to you. The railing is 1/4 by 1/4 square and 2¼ inches long, the width of the caboose. You can generally buy these square pieces where dowel rods are sold, or you can cut your own. I prefer to buy the material when I can because cutting a number of these from 1/4 inch thick poplar is time consuming. I drilled 3 1/8 holes across the railing, one in the middle and one near each end. The holes should only go about halfway through. I drilled holes with the same spacing into the base of the caboose. Then I cut a 1/8 dowel rod into 1-inch long pieces for the rails. With a drop of glue in each hole, I inserted the dowel into the railing and the other end into the caboose's base. The caboose gets topped off with a roof. I spread some glue on top of the cabin as usual, then placed the roof on top. I found that clamps aren't necessary for this assembly, so I set it aside for the glue to dry. These little red bins hold the parts I'll need for the final assembly. They contain wheels, axles, magnets, and roundhead nails with a threaded shaft that helps them grab and stay in place better. I usually start by setting a string of magnets on the workbench. Doing it this way keeps the north poles at one end and the south at the other. This makes it easy to ensure the engine and caboose will attract each other, and the cars will attract both the engine and the caboose. These magnets have a hole in the center through which the nail will fit. The nail holds the magnet in place, and the round head provides a good surface to attach to the next car in the train. I place a nail inside a magnet at each end, then pick up and drive the nail from one side into the engine and the nail from the other side into the caboose. I replace the nails, attach one nail and magnet to the one end of the letter car, and then attach the second nail and magnet combo to the other. It doesn't matter which goes to either end if you ensure they're opposite polarity. Then it's a good idea to check that the engine, car, and caboose all couple properly. The last assembly step is to add the wheels and axles. I took the time to set up the depth stop on the drill press when I drilled the holes for the axle pegs to make this step more effortless as well as foolproof. In the past, when I made these trains, there were times when I didn't set the depth stop, and that sometimes caused problems. If I didn't make the hole deep enough, I'd have to go back and make it deeper before I could add the wheels. If I made it too deep and wasn't careful when adding the axle peg, it would end up being too tight against the wheel, and the wheel couldn't turn freely. It's best to have a depth where the peg touches the bottom of the hole and is enough proud of the wheel's surface that it turns freely. This is one of those places where a small glue top applicator is essential. I can fit the tip into the hole, put in a drop or two of glue, and then add the wheel and axle peg. The small tip ensures I don't get any glue outside the hole where it might glue the wheel into place so it won't turn at all. The final step is to make sure the train rolls properly, and it does. Here's a completed train with an engine, letter car, and caboose. The plans include patterns for all 26 letters of the alphabet, and I didn't need to make any in this time because I recently made a large batch of letters. They're easy to cut, so there wouldn't have been much to show while cutting them if I had needed to. The personalized name train makes a great gift. It can be displayed in the nursery for newborns, and once they're old enough to play with it, it can be used as a toy. It was fun to make, and I'm sure it will provide hours of fun for any child who receives one. I love to read your comments on this project. I generally release a new video every week, so be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell, and you won't miss the next project. But if you're in the mood to watch more now, 2 suggestions for videos are on the screen.